welcome everyone on this Seed podcast. And I have the great honor of presenting our guest speaker, who is none other than Saul Betmead de Chasteigner, who is an ex-colleague of mine. My name is Laszlo Acél. I'm the Marketing and Partnerships Managing Faculty at Seed. And Saul is an ex-colleague of mine. We work together at WPP, which is a large agency company where Saul was the Chief Strategy Officer for EMEA. So he has his background, one of his backgrounds in strategy. He's also worked as a Chief Marketing Officer for the UN World Food Programme. He's a cognitive psychologist, and he's also an associate fellow in Saïd Business School in Oxford. So Saul's presentation, which is titled The Innovation Paradox, will be actually a recap of, not a recap, but it will be very similar to the speech that Saul held on the alumni event previously. Please enjoy, everyone, in the name of Seed, and welcome Saul, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laxi, and thank you everybody for coming. I know everybody's very busy, and I appreciate you coming to have a listen. So what I'd like to talk about today is something that I feel is probably the most important, but arguably misunderstood or unclear subject that I've come across, and that is, what is the shape of an effective strategy? When you look at, if I were to ask everybody on this call what they thought strategy was and what an effective one was, you probably all have a slightly different idea. And I work with, both at the business school but also as a consultant, with lots of organizations in lots of different places, and even amongst a tight management team of a small scale up, it's often not entirely clear whether they all agree on what their strategy is. And even within a large organization, you'll have different manifestations of it. You'll have different types of strategy, from a marketing strategy, commercial strategy, sales strategy, technology strategy, HR strategy. It's one of those subjects that is it can get very complicated very quickly. And you also have, as I mentioned when I was doing the keynote, a lot of really smart people have thought about this over time. From anybody who's done any work on the Seed project will know the Lafley-Martin cascade model, which is a really powerful tool for thinking about decisions. You've got the classic business model canvas. You've got Barney's VIO, which I'll talk about later. You've got lots of different types of thinking tools. But you also have, and again, this is my specialty, which is I'm an innovation strategy expert, is strategy is often seen as a static thing. But you can't imagine what a strategy is, an effective one, without asking a simple question, which is actually, what role can and should innovation play with that? Because if you're not innovating, the world will change around you, and you'll end up out of kilter with the way that the markets and the category is evolving. So innovation is a critical part of any sort of strategy conversation. And there are lots, again, there are entire disciplines, especially in academia, that attempt to do this, from the TMO framework from my colleague at Oxford, Mark Ventresca, which thinks about system builders and how entrepreneurs are system builders and how they pull new skills together, all the way through to knowledge brokering cycles, where large organizations are really not very good at recycling ideas and putting them in other places where even if they're not relevant in one place, they might be very relevant in another. So for me, what's interesting is, how do you answer those two questions? And this is the core of my research and my work at Oxford, which is, what is the shape of an effective strategy, and then what role can an innovation play? And my wife calls me a framework monkey. I like to think about things in systems. So for me, there are two fundamental aspects to this. One is mindset. As Laxi mentioned, I've got a background in cognitive psychology, but I also do a lot of work in peace building and leadership, and I worked for the UN for quite a long time. So I learned a lot about what mindsets you need to have a effective strategy in that space, but also the method. There's lots of really interesting frameworks. I draw on a couple of those in my hunch about what the answer to this is. But also, I'm an advisor to a new mental health organization called My Mind, and I've used this to help shape that thinking as well as other startups. So that's the basis of this presentation. Is what goes in those boxes in terms of mindset and method. I always think it's important just to clarify what I mean by strategy. So this is an assumption based on the rest of the presentation is based on. So strategy is what shapes decisions over time. It's a glue that binds, and it's critical to any company being successful or not, both in the short term and the long term. It's the organizing idea, the organizing playbook. And therefore, all strategic problems probably come back to three things, which is either a strategy action gap. So the strategy is good, it's just not executed. And there's some really great papers on this. I'm very happy to share them later. Strategy is executed, but it's just not the right one. But the strategy was right, but then circumstances have changed and it hasn't for lots of different reasons. So what that means is you've got strategic problems you've got in the moment. So that's in any given week or month or year. And then its ability to evolve over time. So there's a basic premise behind the thinking in this talk. For me, what's interesting is there's a question that sits behind that, which is how common is ineffective strategy? So if we say that effective strategy, what's the shape of it? You have to have a sense of whether most strategies are doing okay and whether they're not doing okay and why. Because there isn't really an agreed definition of what a strategy is, you have to look at outcomes and symptoms. Although this is a vast subject and there's probably counter arguments to a number of these elements, but the way I've thought about it is there's three kinds of organization. One is starting up. So there's these are entrepreneurs trying to get a market fit and build their business from the bottom up. There's scale ups who are they've got proof of concept, but they're trying to scale up their business in lots of different ways. And then I call it keeping ups. So these are larger organizations that have been successful and they need to keep up with themselves, so their growth targets, but also keep up with an evolving world around them. So again, you'll be familiar with these sort of things. If you read any sort of academic papers, you'll realize that startups, it's a gamble. Most startups fail. I think the paper I saw was about 90%. 10% of those businesses don't survive the first year, and then 18% of first-time founders just don't make it. So it's a real gamble, and a lot of people do not succeed. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. Then scaling up. So the way I always think about this is the metaphor is the accelerator is working. So you've got proof of concept. You've got a business that has a lot of potential, but the engine struggles to keep up with that accelerator. So a couple of key things, and then this is from a Deloitte study, but this is consistent with my work. You have a minimal viable product focus at the start, and that's how the organization is geared up. But then the scalable architecture it's required to deliver isn't the same as an MVP focus. It's called tech debt. So never really catch up with it. Also, especially in the B2B space, the marketing cycles get longer and longer, and that means they end up with a cash flow problem. So the runway is too short, and they also don't have the kind of expertise to help them out of those situations and think about those problems. And then keeping up, so large organizations, there's now a very famous McKinsey report talking about the S&P 500. These are the largest, some of the largest companies on earth. The tenure in that over time, a rolling average, trends downwards. So the tenure is getting shorter and shorter over time. There's also, and then this is analysis from Dartmouth and Boston, looking at actually when you look at those companies over time, actually there is a unicorn bias, and we might unpack that later. But only 12 of those newer companies added in the last 25 years are actually new ones. 324 older companies growing and getting big enough to go into that group. And this is probably the most famous one that it's slightly contentious, I think, if you look at the analytics, but it's indicative. It seems to be getting harder. So the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 80 years ago was 67. Now it's 15. So there's lots of different evidence that comes with this, but it's not an easy, being a successful business and staying a successful business is not an easy thing to do. I think most people would agree with that. For me, the interesting question is, why is that the case? One of them is obvious, which is the pace of change is getting faster and faster. One metric that's often used is how quickly a company, obviously this isn't technology orientated, how quickly a company gets to 1 million users. So the telephone was 75 years, Netflix 3.5 years, Facebook 9 months, Instagram 2.5 months, ChatGPT was 5 days. I don't think DeepSeek has released it because of its country of origin has released it, but it's probably a lot shorter than 5 days. But the pace of change and technology is very, very fast. Many of you may be familiar with this, which is a famous book from Professor Christensen, late Professor Christensen at Harvard, called The Innovator's Dilemma. And he observed that it's a slightly ironic situation where companies that are doing really well, riding high, have all the resources, all the people, all the network, they often get sidestepped by new technologies that not only do they know about, but they'd invested heavily in and sometimes actually invented, but they just don't know what to do with it. They struggle to work out how to integrate it into their current business. And this is often referred to as the explore-exploit paradox. So how do you exploit what you're currently good at, whilst also exploring what you might need to be good at in the future? You need to do those. You need to hold those two things at the same time. And the body language of those things are: the exploit is optimization, efficiency, incremental, sustaining innovation, as they're called. So this is a known system with a really clear sense of what is going on and why it's going on like that. Explore is a fundamentally different way of being, which is about experimentation, high risk. It involves radical innovations that may or may not work. And what that means, I always find it helpful just to think of this, is I live in kind of metaphors. It's like, this is an ordered space that's very clear what's going on versus a chaotic space with an enormous amount of ambiguity and change in it. And what that means is, in the academic literature, it's called a dominant design. So, you've got, it's very clear what most people think as an automobile at the moment. And it's demand pull because people know what they want, and they know how to navigate that space in a simple way. Explore is a load of potential, what I call S-curves, so a whole new load of dominant designs. It is supply push. So because the consumer doesn't really know what they want to buy, whether that's in a B2B or everyday customers on the street, because they don't want to buy, they don't know what good looks like. This is the area of kind of blue ocean strategy. And for me, the two examples are that really kind of allow me to understand this in better ways. Like, Ford said, if you'd asked me what the customer wanted, they would have said, "Give me a faster horse." Never create a new way of thinking about technology, a new way of locomotion. And also, Steve Jobs, we need to make people want this computer because they didn't really want it. They didn't understand what it was. So you've got this, and for me, the most interesting example of this is the natural ice industry between the 1700s and 1800s in the US, and then globally. So you have massive population increase, urbanization around the world, rising living standards, and then this urge to have food preservation on demand. And started out on the East Coast of America, where you have lots of cold climate, and they just started building an industry around natural ice. So they'd cut it, find out a way of shipping it, and then send it to Caribbean and other warm places. Started off in the southern states of the US, where they just needed to refrigerate things in a particular way. And it was just, what you see is lots of innovations around how to get natural ice out from these calipers to saws, all the way through to really kind of funky engines designed to saw and pull stuff out. So really, this is incremental. This is a really good example of incremental innovation. So it's known, they know what they're trying to do. I'm not going to explain this chart other than to say that this I didn't do this, but somebody mapped out across time the evolution of, firstly, the ice industry. So you see in the red on the left, that's when Tudor, who's founded a very big company and became they call him the Ice King, started shipping from Charlestown, Massachusetts to Martinique around the Caribbean, all the way through to even almost 80 years later. There's still those continuous little incremental improvements in the ice harvest technology still going on, whilst at the same time, right towards the 1880s, a commercially viable product of the thing that replaced it, which is an ice machine, a refrigerator, was being built. So you see that there's a dominant design that continued right into a time when actually there was a very, very clearly better version of that what is called a job to be done in the market. And this guy on the right, Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, he dominated it, became an incredibly wealthy man. He saw refrigeration coming and didn't do anything about it. In fact, he tried to destroy it. So this poor guy on the left, Dr. John Gorrie, he created an ice machine to help cool patients who had yellow fever. And Frederick Tudor actually ended up doing a kind of tried to destroy his reputation with a smear campaign long before it became a viable product. But he could have easily embraced it. And for me, it's just one of those perfect examples of not embracing a new technology that was clearly going to take him out at some point. I won't go into this too much, but there's the Frosby flop up until the Frosby flop method. Everybody had a straddle method. So the high jump, they went over forwards, and Dick Frosby, who'd been using that all his career, he was quite late in his career, just decided to experiment with another way of doing it, which is actually, I'm going to challenge assumptions. Maybe if I go over backwards, it's easier. And he not only dominated the sport when he started doing it, but 1 or 2 Olympics later, everybody was doing it, but nobody'd seen that. And it took quite a long time to adopt because people got stuck in the way of thinking. The examples that are usually given, the kind of poster children of this, are Blockbuster and Netflix. So Blockbuster, for those old enough to remember, were VHS, very, very successful VHS films in shops on the high street in almost every town in the city had them, versus Netflix, who evolved a lot over time. Perhaps we can talk about that later. But at some point, they went to Blockbuster and said, "Look, streaming is coming. We'll be your streaming system for you." I think it was something ridiculous, like $1.25 million they offered to sell themselves to, and they said, "No." Blockbuster said, "No, we're fine. We don't need you. We've got this, or we're not interested in it." And for me, the more interesting one is Kodak, which they invented digital photography. They had a whole department aligned with it, building it, but they never really managed to go to market in any tangible way that allowed them to dominate the market in the way that Sony and its cyber shots did. For me, what's interesting though is, there's lots of examples of companies evolving, but for me, the interesting one is Fujifilm, because it was in a very similar space to Kodak, and they did something else, which is they realized that the stuff that they had on the table, their capabilities, could be made into other things. So they had imaging expertise, and they ended up creating digital X-ray systems, and then that moved into medical imaging, and are now one of the leaders in medical imaging. But also, they realized that the same antioxidants that prevented colors from fading in film could also be used to help in skincare products, and they do a lot of anti-aging work. So they were able to do something that Kodak wasn't able to do, which is evolve into something else. So I call this a kind of story of reinvention, where some companies seem to be able to keep reinventing themselves in a really big way or in a small way, to take advantage of capabilities they have within their market, but also using those to jump into adjacent spaces. Well, whilst others, actually most companies, don't seem to be able to do that. So that leads you to a question, which is, well, why is that the case? Why do a lot of companies struggle to do those things? It's one part of this is about it's essentially extreme ambidextrous. So explore and exploit. It's like writing and drawing very, very clearly with one hand as well as the other, but in a very different kind of media. But for me, the most credible, and this is a great book, by the way, if you want to read it, called Leading the Disrupt by Aurelian Tushman. They say their hunch is, and I think it's right, which is the higher performing an organization, the more likely it is to have a stronger, what they call a success syndrome. So the entire organization is built to do exploit, so that all their KPIs, their reward systems, the operating model, the way the culture is formed and shaped, who they bring in, who they fire, it all designed to hold stuff in place. This is an example of what Porter, the famous management academic, would call a reinforcing activity system. It's a virtuous system that holds stuff in place. And in any given moment, it's really helpful. But it means that they're not able to look outside that success syndrome. So, this is exploit dominant. It means anything to do with explore can often get, even if it's taken seriously up to a point, will not get taken seriously enough. And this is where there's another part of that, which is a fundamental human trait, which we all have, which is leaning into my psychology background, which is a number of key biases that we all have. So functional fixedness, we have great difficulty seeing new ways of doing certain things if we've always used something in a certain way. So my Oxford mug, I have great difficulty imagining it being used in another way that doesn't involve drinking stuff. Consistency bias, when you've said something, when you've publicly declared something, when you've thought about something in a particular way, we have a tendency to keep looking for things that support existing points of view and actively negate other points of view. And it's one of the reasons why people's political opinions often get very, very cemented in place, because you just don't look for anything that might compete with your point of view, even though you know you probably should. There's the anchoring bias, which is the first time you do something, that tends to shape your experiences from that point onwards, and also habits. So we get stuck in habits. We are very, very habitual animals, and we find them very, very difficult to break. So you've got the success syndrome with all these cognitive biases and habits that hold them in place in a really strong way. But I think there's also another problem here, which is, and I call them strategic blind spots. There is an obsession with disruptive innovation. I don't. If you all you have to do is Google disruptive innovation, and you'll find an enormous amount of really, really good book. But for me, they kind of blind us to a real truth, which is, whilst successful long-term strategy is often integral, has an integral component of technology to it. What it really does, it always has disruptive thinking and beliefs, and they create new theories of value. So whilst technology is important, it's actually the thinking that shapes it, which is actually much more disruptive. So Netflix and Shine, you can see, Netflix was very important because of technology. It wouldn't have allowed it to create videos on demand in 160 countries with virtually no physical infrastructure. Sheen wouldn't have been able to create a new business model where you've got, rather than creating 40,000 SKUs, they just get pictures of 40,000 products, and then they sell what people want. So that's technology. That's obviously driven by technology. But the disruptive thinking is more important for more things. So again, the poster children are Airbnb. So with the right systems, there was a latent room capacity in every urban centre. And the technology already existed in lots of different places. They just pulled it together through a different kind of this thinking system. Uber was very similar. They saw a latent taxi in every car and every driver. that could radically change their experience. But again, the technology wasn't particularly new. It's just the way they organized it was particularly new. I couldn't help myself. There's I'd never heard of this guy before. Oh. Okay. So this is Ken Olsen, the CEO of computer giant Digital Equipment Corporation. I'd never heard of them, which I guess is telling. There's no reason for any individual to have a computer in his home. He's slightly misogynistic. And then you've got Steve. What a computer is to me is the most remarkable tool that we've ever had to come up with. It's the equivalent of a bicycle for our mind. You've got two fundamentally different belief systems. His based on the dominant design of the category at the time, and Apple having a very different point of view. That, yes, informed its technological selection, like graphic interfaces and things like that, but it was a thinking thing. It was a disruptive thinking force rather than disruptive innovation force. So we kind of get to this idea that the future is already here. We just haven't seen it yet. And it's about how you see and how you think about the world is actually as important as any sort of technological wave. I think that's even more important with AI. Perhaps we can talk about that later. So for me, the engine, my hypothesis is this, is that the engine of an effective strategy is the ability to think what others don't, so you can see what others can't. And that's, if you think about strategy like that, it changes how you observe and think about the mindset and the method. So if that's the case, you need a mindset that allows you to help people think differently. And the way I think about this is building bridges, not walls. So bridges to new ideas, bridges to new ways of thinking. Jim Collins, who is a very famous management academic, has written lots of great books, from one of them, which is called Good to Great. But he has this theory, which is, he says, great leaders have two qualities at the same time. They have natural authority, they know their shit, but they also understand that there's a lot of stuff they don't know and they might be wrong in any given moment. So it's a balance of those two things at any point in time. So that's one thing. So the second thing is you need to build in cognitive diversity. So the ability to have within an organization to have people with diverse views that aren't necessarily consistent, so that they can look for different perspectives and challenge basic assumptions that hold the organization and strategy in place. Also, create psychological empowerment. And this is different from psychological safety. It's a great study, a Chinese study, where they found that when people were psychologically safe, yes, they were more creative, but when they were given permission and actively encouraged to make mistakes, their creativity level went up quite dramatically. But they were actually allowed to make mistakes. They weren't just said, oh, you come up with some interesting ideas. They were actually encouraged to come up with new ways of thinking about things. So those are two other things. Also, and this, we come back to Seed for a second, and Oxford, my work at Oxford. There is a fundamental thing that sits across all academia, which is most students are about knowledge acquisition and application, but in almost every department of every place or any academic, there is also innovation and growth. They're trying to move their subject forward. They're always trying to push it, and it's often not seen especially in old institutions like Oxford. It's not seen as an innovative place, but it's at the heart of what academia is. I call it the ability to think things through and have critical action, which is argumentation. So for me, this comes from a thinking system by a German philosopher called George Hegel. And you may be familiar with this, but it's a really helpful tool for thinking around things, which is thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And his argument is this: is you have to explore tensions and then resolve them to move ideas forward in whatever category you're playing in. So if we put that in the innovation and strategy space, you go, okay, well, the thesis is, what are the rules of the game? What is the dominant design, the dominant belief system? So what do most people believe in the category? And then you have the antithesis, which is, where could those rules be broken? It might be by technology, but what is possible if they were? So what are the new rules of the game potentially? And then what do you do with those? What sits between those two things? How do you create a new set of rules? And then what would need to be in place for them to be true? So I talk about a new theory of value, but what are the rules that potentially could be wrong, and how do you move them forward? Time check. Back we go. And so there's a third one, which is I use this quote from Warren Buffett, which I think is really important, which is the biggest thing that kills businesses is complacency. So you need anti-complacency weapons. So when I'm working with clients, the management teams, I get them to ask a simple question, which is, what is our elephant in the room? And that is not just the management team, but also everybody in the organization, the people at the front line who really understand the shifting culture and technology. Questions like, do we have meetings where we don't talk about the most important things? So stuff is put under the carpet. And is there anything anywhere where we're lying to ourselves, where we've kind of got our head in the sand? Those sort of questions can often raise interesting insights about actually the way that the market is evolving and where the company probably should respond. Another anti-complacency weapon is what I call the fresh start. So if we were to start the company today, what would it look like? Would it be different, and why would it be different? That can often uncover interesting points of view. And then the last one is this is a colleague of mine at Oxford. He wrote a book called The Four Workarounds, and he basically looks at, when situations aren't perfect, how do people fix problems? And he's got four of them. The one I find really interesting and most useful is what he calls the piggyback, which is the example he uses is Zambia has a real problem with childhood diarrhea. It's quite easily fixed. You just need a certain kind of medication. The medication is available. They just couldn't get it to very rural communities. But they realized, and Cola Life is a charity that helped do this, they realized that other people could get to those places, Coca-Cola, for example. So what they did was they just created the pack, put it into the Coca-Cola boxes, and then distributed them around the country. So piggyback is one example, just a way of, he calls them scrappy organizations, fix problems. It often gives you a window into another way of being, another way of doing things that perhaps if you had massive resources, you wouldn't come across, you wouldn't think about. So that is the mindset. So you've got building bridges, not walls. You've got this balance of authority and humility. You've got psychological empowerment, argumentation about questioning what you think you know, and then building onwards. And then you've got anti-complacency weapons and workarounds. So that's mindset. You then get method. So this is from an ex-colleague of mine at Oxford who's now in the States, and a guy called Todd Zenger. And they have their fundamental premise is, they say, look, we need to think of strategy as a value, as a new theory of value that you have about an answer to a particular situation. And then company runs experiments based on that theory. And if it's right, great. They compound. If it's wrong, they do something else. What that means is, and if you remember back to the beginning of the presentation, there's often a strategy action gap. Because you'll have a theory and you're running experiments to test that theory, there really isn't a strategy action gap, because you can't really have a theory of running experiments if your strategy is not something that you're actually physically doing in the real world. And then also just the last part is just, it's always in beta. It has to evolve in the face of opportunity and challenge. And that's like any good theory, it evolves. It has to, as the new information comes in, as new thinking comes in, it evolves. So I personally find this a really helpful way of thinking about what strategy is. And also they've run lots of entrepreneur experiments with startups, and it's a really helpful way of thinking about successful launches. I also realized that there are key attributes that this must have. I call it the 5G. So that theory must be generalizable. So it needs to work across an organization in all different kinds of strategy, whether it's marketing, commercial, or HR, what we talked about before. It needs to be generative, so it needs to come up with new ideas, both incremental but also radical. And that means it's able to grow over time and evolve into something else. It needs to be gettable. And this comes from my background in marketing and advertising. Is it just, you can have the best strategy in the world with innovation baked in. If people don't get it and find it interesting, you've got an enormous problem. Even if you pay them lots of money to do it, if they don't buy it, they don't buy into it, you've got a real problem. And that means it has to be gripping as well. So it has to be something that really holds what I call lighting the fire and then lighting the way. So it has to have emotional traction as well as functional traction. And so this is coming to the end now. So I built on the work from the Value Lab, and I think there are what I call 5 sights. So first one is hindsight, which is the ability to look at, to capture the conventional thinking, what the rules of the game are, the current theory of value in any given category or discipline. You start there and go, okay, what are they? And then what do we believe that is different from that? So it forces your hand. So okay, I call it foresight. So what are potential new rules of the game? What I call maverick beliefs. So what are beliefs that people wouldn't necessarily agree with, and how does that create a new theory of value that you can then go into market and reorganize the market in a new way? That then flows into insight, which is, how does the stuff that you have in the organization, the capabilities, the resources, the partnerships, how does it deliver on that in an interesting way that is, and again, I mentioned Barney's VIRO, which is valuable, rare, and imitability. So how does that combination of capabilities and resources uniquely allow you to deliver on that new theory of value? And then outside, what I call outside, which is, what, in order to grow into the future, what does the shape of the new organization that complements those insights? So that might be vertical and horizontal integration, it might be mergers and acquisitions, it might be partnerships, things that allow the foresight to be delivered in new ways, in new potential new places. And then the last sight is oversight. So that's how is the organization structured to deliver on that insight and that outsight? How does it pull itself together? And also, what principles of action does it have? So what are its guardrails and its red lines? This is similar concept to values. I find values a bit hard to work with because they're quite vague, and most people will agree to most values. Principles are values in action in my book. And then lastly, you get a set of convictions at the start, which, as I mentioned before, kind of lights the fire, but then also lights the way. And that has emotional traction, but also functional traction. And then all of this, because it's a theory, you have the company has to have the ability to sense what's going on in the environment. That's technological changes, that's cultural changes, customer need changes, competitor pressure, shape a response within the organization, a way of prioritizing that response and then seizing that. And the really good organizations have the 3 S's. They're able to do that at the same time. But it all comes back to the same engine, which is those 5 sites. So you've got mindset and a method. I just wanted, I had an argument with myself, which is, okay, if I was a cynical person, which I am, you'd say, well, okay, well, why would I challenge assumptions like that? Why would I have hindsight and foresight and insight? For me, there are 3 parts to it. One is because if you're looking at your own assumptions and checking yourself on a regular basis, you're better able to defend against both incremental innovations, but also radical innovations, because you've got a sense of what's going on. It means you're better able to attack. So if you're ahead of the game, you can then come to market in a quite a different way. And then also that comes back to the reinvention thing, is that you're also able to look at how your capabilities and resources are then able to potentially get you out of the category entirely and into another one. So there you go. That's my hunch about what an effective strategy is and how you integrate innovation into it. So I was saying to Lazzi and Fanny before, this thinking is only as good as it's useful, and it evolves all the time. But actually, it's evolved quite a bit since the keynote in Budapest in February. I'd love to hear from you. So my email address is there.